Demystifying the economics of workforce planning. That sounds rather mysterious to me, if not magical. As I thought about this presentation and I thought about that title, I started thinking, well, there's going to be some serious expectations of me. Coming from HR, they're going to think, okay, he's going to deliver the silver bullet or the magic dust. And we all know that bullets and white powders are very dangerous in public places. So therefore, I thought that I'd go to my Simplify application and come up with how can we drive better business performance, better business results through the use of workforce planning. So I'd like to talk to you about today is really if you have a thoughtful process, thoughtful methodology, very deliberate decisions, you can better enable your business. And I like to reference a comment that Jan made earlier today. He was showing the evolution of HR in a step process. And at that highest level of aspirational state, I believe the term was business-driven HR. And he's exactly right. And as we move forward in HR and we try to move up that value chain to the extent we could be embedded in that business through workforce planning, we will be a more valued partner and we will help deliver better business results. I know that each of you today, you made a very intentional decision to come here with the hopes that you would learn, understand, be able to identify some value that you'll be able to take back to your workplace so that it would be more helpful to them. So trying to focus on value, I like to talk about the value of workforce planning. And throughout the presentation, there'll be three themes. And those themes will really be on workforce planning and how we can actually make a better workforce analytics or more relevant workforce analytics with the use or collaboration of external labor market data, and how we would be able to shape better or enhanced talent strategies through a better understanding of human capital and competitive intelligence. So before we go to that aspirational conversation, we know that in HR we've got a history. We've got a little baggage that we've got to acknowledge. Some of those cliches that when we've gone to our customer, they're like, okay, this is all about HR for HR. Or you're here to do HR to us again, aren't you? Or, yeah, it's all about you. It's all about HR. Or worse, the way you all behave, you think HR is the end game. That couldn't be further from the truth. HR, or workforce planning, if done well, will help HR to better inform, to better link, to better shape, to better drive business decisions so that we can achieve the desired outcomes for that business. So speaking of business, today they say the rate of change, the velocity of change is extreme. So many different things are happening at the same time. Some of them begin to compete or even conflict with one another. One of my favorites, we want you to standardize product, remove cost, while at the same time you'll have that request, well, I want point solutions. Every consumer is an individual, so you've got competing wants there. I want you to be more affordable. As businesses try to move more affordable, that affects the nature of competition, maybe fields of entry, that's going to affect your workforce. Constant game changers, that could be technology, that can be data, that can be different markets that you're moving into. New and emerging marketplaces. I didn't mention earlier, but I come from the aerospace and defense industry, so we have our core markets. But as we look at our capabilities and we want to extend or expand those markets, we have to become more familiar with what are the talents in those marketplaces, what are the differences or changes with competition. Multiple business models. We're in over 45 states and 70 countries. Some of our businesses are service-oriented. Some are very platform-oriented. As you look at all of these different businesses across different locations, there's different ledgers, different models. How do you adapt to each of these? And each of these have different requirements on the workforce cost, allocation, regulations, compliances, et cetera, for that business. You can't just move in there and react and respond and be successful. You need to have a plan. Changing participants, nature of competition, evolving IT capabilities. big data. How many companies do we hear about today that they move into the marketplace as one company, they develop capabilities here, and they're doing something entirely different? So transitioning from the complexity, the change of business, and how are we going to stay relevant to that business? Before I get into the what and the how of workforce planning, if I were talking to my customer, that customer is going to want to hear from me, what is the value of workforce planning? What are you going to help me do better? So towards that end, planning for operational needs, informing new or potential business ventures, adapting to new markets, market adjacencies, optimizing the labor portfolio. So when I think of labor portfolio, what is the shape of your mix, levels, grades of that organization, salary, labor cost. You can't just mature as an organization and carry that cost. You need to get creative on how you can continuously redeploy your talent so that you optimize your cost, you optimize your capability. How can you respond to changing business needs? Capitalize on demographic and generational shifts. We just finished hearing about generational differences and where's the baby boomer going and what percent they are of the organization. As you incur these shifts, as you can anticipate these shifts, if you are going to be one of those organizations that's going to be a talent magnet, as we've heard before, you need to understand that talent as a consumer. That consumer has preferences. Those preferences can be generalized through the generations as one filter. Anticipate skill shortages. And I like the last one, invest in brands wisely. So when I think about our company, the company may have a brand, but when I think of certain talent segments, our brand in one talent segment may be at the top of the food chain. If I go to another school and I look for a particular talent, I may be a little challenged to compete with some of the more contemporary companies that are out there. So to understand your talent very specifically as a consumer and how does your brand play to that consumer will better enable you, will better inform you to create strategies so that you can win. So the next piece, I want to focus really on capability and capacity. So it's all about the workforce planning model. And that workforce planning model, you can derive it from a variety of sources. We looked at consultants. We looked at a number of the HR organizations. We looked at a lot of literature. We looked at our history. And as a result of that, we came up with what we want to be our model. But what is important about that, it cannot be happenstance. It just can't simply evolve. It needs to be a very thoughtful and deliberate decision. It needs to be a very deliberate decision. It needs to have, I will say, strong sponsorship. Some people say, well, does it have the top executive sponsorship? That's desired. You don't have to wait for that. You simply need very strong advocacy for people who have influence and affluence within your respective organization. You need to look at the strategy around the workforce planning and the scaling of the workforce planning. How big is this effort going to be? If I'm a 100,000 person organization, am I really looking to affect 10,000? Am I looking to affect 100,000? Am I going to push it from the center in a small group of one, or am I going to enable an army and distribute and deliver it through an army? What's my engagement strategy? Am I going to use technology? Am I going to use people? Am I going to leverage subject matter experts? Methodology and tools. I mentioned before that there's a variety of tools and methods that are out there. Once you develop your methodology, how are you going to make these available to that constituency? So to give you an anecdotal, the way we have done it is that we have certified subject matter experts. We have then gone out and taught and developed subject matter experts within the business organizations. They, in turn, will lead efforts. They will lead teams. We will enable those teams by providing tools, processes, templates, scripts, so that they can engage the organization. We will apply the quality control so that we can ensure the product, as they develop their product, will be consistent across the enterprise, across businesses, and up to a quality that we stipulate for that end game. And finally, a very important piece on this is the research capability. A lot of folks think of workforce planning. Is it a mathematical exercise? Is it an OE, OD exercise? Well, and the answer is yes to that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But there's a research component, and when I say research, I'm not just talking about how you understand what your organization looks like internally, but it's about how your organization pulses and understands the labor markets in which it competes and delivers business. And so when you're thinking about that research capability, is this going to be first-order research that you do? And I mentioned earlier we're in over 45 states and 70 countries. Am I really going to go to each of those states and perform surveys? Probably not. So how am I going to reach out through consultants, through publications, through subscription? And the answer is I want to use all of those. The thought process for you would be, what are the resources available to you? What is the depth and the reach of that ask of you? And then what combination of this portfolio can you afford to buy so that you have the research capabilities? When I think of the workforce planning process itself, it really begins, if we are going to be business-driven HR, as I mentioned earlier, it starts with that business strategy. What are those business documents? And you don't have to read every document, but you sure better understand what are they doing operationally, what are they doing in the next 2 to 3 years, what are they doing in the next 3 to 5 and beyond. And it's not one approach, but you can look at the convergence of multiple approaches. The business may move from here to there, but you may have strategy, dedicated strategic resources within your organization that are looking to that distant horizon, trying to understand what are the strategic threads of your organization and how that can contribute to what market you compete in the future. So again, it's understanding that strategy, understanding the market you're going to play in, and then what talent would that translate to? And when I say talent, I'm not looking necessarily for every possible talent that's going to populate your organization, but what are those critical talent segments that would allow you to discriminate or differentiate your product or capability versus your competition? That's not necessarily the most complex job or discipline, but it might be the one that pivots. And I use that word pivot. John Boudreau is one of the contemporary thought leaders who, that when he talks about talent segments, he'll say, what will that buy decision or that performance decision, what will it pivot on? And that's what I subscribe you need to look at within the roles. Environmental scan. This is an extremely important area because this essentially is the filter. As I think about my business strategy and I understand what my requirements are, I need to put that in context. And that context needs to take consideration of the labor supply internally, externally, the nature of business internally and externally. So what's happening with the regulatory bodies? What's happening economically? What's happening with technology or the competition? All of those are important. All of those will help inform your decisions. I referenced research earlier. It's in this environmental scanning area that if you have a good research capability so that you can investigate the various markets where you do play or where you want to participate successfully, you want to understand what is the supply of that talent in those areas. What is the demand for that? Who are the competitors? What are their value propositions? How does that compare to your value proposition? Can you compete? Can you afford to compete? Do you want to compete? What's your brand? All of these are questions you need to ask yourself so that as you put forth and develop a strategy, you're deciding to, we heard about the ROI earlier, we're making an investment here. And is this going to be an investment that has significant impact on our business? Alternative futures. This isn't just thinking linearly that wherever I'm at today, I'm going to fast forward 2 or 3 years and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to have an attrition of X and therefore that's what I'm going to hire. No, we're in a volatile environment. You need to think about your future from a business and a labor market perspective. What are those things that are happening within your industry that can be disruptive to you? What are those things that your organization is doing that can be disruptive to the industry? And what are the probabilities of that happening? So you're going to have a preferred future or an expected future. That's good. Then you need to understand what is the labor market around that preferred future going to look like. You're also going to want, I'm going to say, an upper and lower control limit with those futures so that whatever future begins to develop, you have a sense of a plan and you're not just reacting. And then finally, once you've talked about this future, you understand what your organization looks like, you understand the supply and demand characteristics internally and externally, you're going to have gaps. And when you look at those gaps, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where, and this is how HR needs to make decisions on what it wants to do with compensation or total rewards, what it wants to do with talent acquisition, what it wants to do with development, how it wants to affect culture, how it wants to expend its limited resources. And why am I saying it that way? When I look at my gaps, I'm going to try to identify and prioritize those that are going to have greatest impact to the business. And when I do that, I'm going to have to create mitigation strategies around those gaps. So we happen to use what we call the 6 Bs, which are the buy, build, borrow, bind, bounce, which is a riff, and balance. That's nirvana, balance. But seriously, if I have a gap, and that gap is to build, then I'm probably going to want someone in my learning and development organization to take point on what should that mitigation strategy be. But it doesn't stop there, because in the new world of HR, we're no longer in our silos. We know that we're working horizontally, and even though that individual is creating that mitigation strategy, is there anything about my need to retain certain expertise? Oh, well then I might have to bind them. I might have to talk to my compensation folks. Is there anything as I'm developing I need to think about my culture that's going to cause an org design or some other type of intervention? So typically these are going to be integrated efforts, not just coming from one COE within HR, but what I'll say a team effort. Oh God, that's the baby boomer in me. But it's having the right person in front of it, working with the right stakeholders, and whatever that gap is that you're trying to solve, make sure that you have a strategy for it. And before I move on, let me pause. I use that term workforce planning. And as you sit there, probably each of you have a vision in your mind as to what that workforce planning is to you or to your organization. I'm here to tell you that whatever that vision you have is, it's probably different with your neighbor. There's probably 3, 4, 5, or 6 different versions of a workforce plan, and I'm not here to say that one is right. They're probably all right. So let me share with you in terms of workforce plans. Some of you may think of a workforce plan and you're actually thinking about next year's budget. Each month, what's my head count going to be with regard to labor, and how can I forecast that to make sure I'm doing everything right to support it? And yep, that's a workforce plan. Some of you might be thinking, well, if I'm going to go to full production or I'm going to have to deliver something 2 years from now, what's that total workforce going to like to be down to the detailed discipline, and how am I going to want to shape that workforce so that I could fit into the economics of my business proposal? That's a workforce plan. Some of you might be thinking, well, I have a bunch of retirees coming up. All these baby boomers are getting ready to say adios with the stock market doing well. Do I have any risk here? What's my health? Let me take a look at that. That's a workforce plan. Others yet might say, well, as I look to the future and I'm going to move into market adjacencies, or I recognize some emerging competition that I'm a little worried about, what are going to be those very critical talent segments in my organization that if I'm able to do it right with that, I'll remain the winner or I'll become the winner? All of those are examples of workforce plans, and I share that with you to demonstrate that workforce planning can happen at a variety of flavors or a variety of levels. So what I have up here, these are some real examples of how business decisions have been made as a result of workforce planning or as a result of good labor market research to inform the business decision makers. So whether, and with us and our company, these kinds of decisions, we're not talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, we're talking millions and billions. So as we've made site selections, it's been informed by the process. Decisions as to whether we should go for a particular contract or not. Many contracts we may go for. Some of those contracts we're going to say, as we understand our workforce and we understand the nature of the competition and we understand what the customer's looking for, we don't know that we can fit in there and retain our brand or do it at our cost. So maybe we're going to make a decision not to go. Or if we do go, what do those rates have to look like? What is our strategy going to be as we bid? And when I say strategy, it's not just how I'm going to have a conversation around the table. Am I going to need to take on some strategic partners? Because as I understand the expertise and the capabilities of my workforce, I know that there are some players out here, and if I put these players on my team, I've got a better chance to win. If I look for a piece of contingency on this workforce, I can get into the economics a little better. All of those are variables that feed a well-informed workforce plan. I talked about those 6 B's earlier. Talked a little bit about organization shaping and partnerships. Talent inventory management. This is very important. Corporate America, it really probably depends. There's old industries and then there's emerging industries. Those older industries, we have older populations. And realistically, we need to really understand where are we with those pipelines and are there any gaps, whether it's the acquisition of talent or a sense of urgency around developing tomorrow's leader. And then finally, you listen to all of this and it's a lot of words. I talked to how we were going to develop experts, how we were going to leverage those experts. And in your mind, you're trying to possibly think about how am I going to do that at home. I would say it's not very expensive. We've developed a SharePoint that we utilize internally. And this SharePoint will focus on those different products and services that we will provide to the organization, to the business of our organization and how we can help them. So we'll talk about workforce planning. We'll talk about research. We'll talk about characterizing their workforce so that they can understand it. We will put out there what I'll say is relevant information and analysis, and we will try to make that available to those HR persons, those business partners that are closest to the executives making the decisions. We don't yet today, but it's in my plan. I want to make this more accessible to the business leaders themselves. So as you think about workforce planning, you may want to think of yourself as a consulting entity and that you've got to demonstrate your value and how you're going to do it. And I hope that what I've shared with you today gives you some better insights on how to achieve just that. Thank you.